All right, good morning. So we are, because we've had some really good class discussions, we're considerably behind where I wanted to be at this point. If you look at the syllabus and the schedule, and we're supposed to have an exam this Thursday. So luckily for you, we will have an exam this Thursday, but it will not cover as many chapters as I had originally planned, which means that it should be somewhat less difficult than if you have, 5 or 6 chapters to cover. It will go through organizational behavior, which we will get to today. I did not bring the ducks today because what I'm going to do, and this will be good for those of you who are horribly shy and don't like to talk and have not gotten any points yet, I'm going to give you an opportunity to earn class participation points by submitting your responses to the remaining vowels typology into a Word doc and then submitting it to a Dropbox on D2L. And then also the organizational behavior challenge, I am also going to allow you to submit that through D2L if you want in the Dropbox. You don't have to. It's just an opportunity for you to get those in-class participation, the participation points, without having to actually talk and raise your hand and run the risk of, having your classmates laugh at you or whatever it is that you have this horrible fear. I don't understand why people don't like to talk in front of groups because I love it, but I recognize that studies show that people would rather go to the dentist than stand up and give a speech. So also the other good thing about the way I'm doing this is that I'm not limiting it for class participation. I said I was limiting it to 2 ducks a day, which is 10 points. I'm not going to limit it to 10 points for either of these. So your ability to earn points is going to be directly proportional to the quality of the answers that you get. So if you go to D2L, and I pulled it up here, I'm viewing it as a student, and you click on vowels and restaurant choice, it says, for the following vowels types, strivers, experiencers, makers, and survivors, list a restaurant that someone in each of the type would enjoy and then discuss why that restaurant would be attractive to a member of the vowels type. Responses to this assignment will be added to your class participation grade, and you have until next Tuesday to complete that assignment and also the one on organizational behavior. We'll talk about that one in just a minute when I get to the organizational behavior, because I've got a PowerPoint on it, but it will be the same. You'll submit it to the Dropbox, and if you go to the assignments again, you'll see that there is a Dropbox for organizational behavior challenge, critical thinking challenge. And so at the bottom there, you can submit that. Again, you'll have a week to complete this. You will have a week. We will not have class on Thursday. You will have that time to do the second exam, but it's not necessarily due on class time. You'll have, again, a week. So you'll have until a week from Thursday to complete the second exam. So a week from today to complete the critical thinking challenges with regard to these vowels typologies, and then the organizational behavior challenge, which I'll talk about in just a minute when we get to organizational behavior. And then a week to do the exam, which will be open by class time on Thursday. So I'll probably have it open before then, but I'm not going to guarantee it because I have to write the exam, and that takes me some time because I predicated about 50% of the questions based on the textbook and about 50% of the questions from my in-class lecture. So that way students say, and I'm always amazed in the comments from the student perception of instructional effectiveness. Some students, and it'll be in the same class, they'll say, I don't know why I bought the book. All of his test questions come from the lecture. And then other students will say, I don't know why I bothered coming to class. All of his test questions came from the book. And I'm like, were you all in the same class? I mean, but whatever. I try to be fair and balanced, just like Fox News. So 50-50, we'll see. All right, so.
I have a question. Is there
Yes.
going to be an essay on this exam or no?
I haven't decided yet. Why?
I was just wondering.
Why? You don't like the essay?
It was threw me off. I was like, oh. But I was just wondering. I was like, okay.
Well, generally speaking, this is a 3,000 level course, and it's sort of important that you be able to not only answer multiple choice. And I also do that because students, there are students who just don't like multiple choice and don't do well at multiple choice. And particularly not the kind of multiple choice questions that I tend to write. When I used to teach American national government, and so this is just, kind of a strategy for you in thinking about how to approach the exams. When I used to teach American national government, the kind of knowledge that we want you to have, if you look at something called the Bloom's taxonomy of learning, there's, sort of superficial learning, which is just being able to identify terms and definitions and things like that. And then there is deeper levels of learning that go into being able to apply. In an American national government course, when I used to teach that class, what I sort of looked for was that you understood, sort of basic definitions, that we have 3 distinct branches of government, for example, in the United States. We have an executive, we have a legislative, and we have a judicial, and they do different things. So the executive is charged with enforcing the law. The legislative branch is in charge of writing the law, and the judicial branch is in charge of interpreting the law, right? I mean, that's what we have. Not every country has this distinct separation of powers, right? They all have those functions, but they don't necessarily have the distinct separation of powers. So that was sort of what I was looking for in that class. In a class like this, that's a 3,000 level, and for most of you, you're business students, and so it's going to be critical that you sort of understand this. What I'm looking for is a deeper level of knowledge and application. And so you have to go through each of the question choices and be able to identify which is the best answer, right? Not everybody's good at that. Some people are good at writing, and so, I generally have an essay, but I haven't decided yet if there will be. I don't always have essays on every exam, but
I just assumed you did.
I have a tendency to think that essays are important so that we can see that you are capable of something that resembles critical thinking skills. Because you're going to be asked to do this, and nobody's going to ask you to write essays, for work, but you're going to have to write reports and things like that are going to ask that you integrate knowledge and be able to solve problems and provide solutions to critical, areas in whatever job you have. And even if it's not a business, if you go to work for a nonprofit or a governmental agency, those kinds of skills are going to be important. One of the things that I have found historically is that since I've moved from being a liberal arts professor to being a college of business professor, business students don't write very well. They have a tendency to want to put everything into PowerPoint bullets. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Liberal arts students generally have a tendency, when I taught things like problems of democracy, and I used to teach criminal law and procedure and the Constitution and constitutional law and administrative law, liberal arts students have a tendency to write really, really well. And I think that's one of the skills. It's also one of the reasons why, historically speaking, the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies have not come from business schools. Business school oftentimes has historically doomed you to sort of middle management in many respects. Because those people who have the liberal arts degrees have a tendency to be broad thinkers. So it's just a different skill set. So I generally think it's kind of important. So any other questions? All right, so we were talking about strivers, low resources, they switch jobs regularly for advancement. This is actually becoming fairly common in our contemporary era. When my grandmother went to work, she started out as a teacher in Kentucky in a one-room schoolhouse. She was really odd in that she actually went to college. And at the time, to be a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in Kentucky, you sort of had to have some college, but you didn't have to have a degree. My grandmother actually had a degree, and then she went on and got a master's degree, which was very, very unusual for someone of her generation to do that. But when she was a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, once you got married, you couldn't be a teacher anymore. That was the rule. So the idea was you got married and you went and you became a housewife, and you didn't, you weren't tainted. You were still sort of pure and chaste. It's a rather old-fashioned way of thinking, and nobody would think that today, although we still have remnants of that in various places, not to that extreme, but I think old ways of thinking. When we moved here to Oklahoma in 1986, for example, I had a teacher who one day she was in class and the next day she wasn't, and she'd been fired because the superintendent of public instruction in Guthrie had walked by. There was an old saloon in Guthrie that's a historic building called the Bluebell Saloon. Tom Mix, who was one of the first sort of Western actors in the era when they were still non-talking movies, they were silent movies, actually tended bar at this bar in Guthrie. He became very, very famous. And she was seen by the superintendent who was walking down the street going to the Pollard Theater at this bar, and he fired her. He said, you aren't seen if you're a teacher in Guthrie going to bars. Can you imagine? And this is 1986. That wasn't that long ago. And she lost her job. So anyway, my grandmother taught in a one-room schoolhouse. Then she married my grandfather. He worked for the Manhattan Project. He ended up with a company called Sandia National Labs as part of that, which is where they developed part of the bomb. Los Alamos is the other lab where they developed, I think they developed the detonating device at Sandia, and they developed the actual bomb at Los Alamos, and then it was tested at Stallion's Gate in the White Sands Missile Range. My grandfather was actually at all of the above ground testing of the nuclear devices, and he was there at the Trinity site at Stallion's Gate. He died of a heart attack very early. And the reason I tell you this story is because this is the difference between modern corporations and what happened back then. And after his funeral, the president of Sandia National Labs came to my grandmother and said, "You have a job with the labs." And they gave her a job. She was the classified records librarian for the lab. So she was in charge of classifying and storing nuclear documents, nuclear secrets. That's not the way businesses operate today. If your spouse dies, they're gonna send you flowers and say, it's so sorry, but they don't do that. Companies in the past used to take care of their employees the way that my grandmother was taken care of by the lab, and she worked there until she retired. She drew a pension. People have a tendency to now switch jobs if you want to get more money or you want to advance. So they say this about strivers, but in reality, it's typical of almost everybody. I have worked here at UCO since I was 22 years old. I started teaching when I was 22, and I've been here, pretty much that entire time, with one little hiatus when I went to New Mexico State to get my PhD. That's not what most of you will do. Most of you will have not only multiple jobs in your lifetime, but you will also probably switch careers in your lifetime. You will probably, even if you start out as an accountant, you may end up doing something radically different towards the end of your career. And that's not atypical. But strivers switch jobs regularly, maybe more so than other types of groups. They enjoy video games and videos for fantasy. They tend to be fun-loving, centers of low-status street culture. Desire to better their lives would often have difficulty achieving this. Part of this can be the cost maybe associated with going to college. There is an alarming statistic. The number of high school graduates that are male and choosing to forego any type of higher education is increasing. There were already more women in college starting, and I think the first year that I went to law school was the first year there were more women in law school than there were men. And that's not atypical because there are more women in the population than men, although that's starting to level out. But historically, men died more frequently than women. Every year, the number of births is roughly equal between males and females, but men have a tendency to die younger, particularly when you get to the teenage years, and men have a tendency to engage in very risky behavior that leads to, premature death. So there are slightly more women in the population than there are men. And the year that I went to law school, I think was the first year that there were more women actually enrolled in law school than there were men, but not significantly. The numbers of men that are choosing to forego college is alarming. And a lot of it has to do with the cost benefit analysis that a lot of you or your peer group are engaging in thinking that it may not be worth it to go into debt, massive amounts of debt, to get this degree. I will tell you, when students ask me or when young people ask me, should I go to college? If you don't have some kind of, and it doesn't necessarily have to be college, but if you do not have some sort of post-secondary education, your chances of achieving middle-class status are greatly diminished. And so I still think that in spite of the fact that the cost is incredible, that you should still consider going to college or going to VOTEC and learning, how to do HVAC or plumbing or electric or something like that. They have a tendency, strivers, to wear their wealth. Come on. Experiencers, on the other hand, have high access to resources. They want everything. They're into the latest fashion. They go against the grain. They're willing to take risks because they have high access to resources. They tend to be very social. They tend to be spontaneous. By the way, these groups tend to be younger. There is a lot of evidence to suggest, for example, when we think about consumer behavior, as you get older, your willingness to try new things decreases. So I was listening to a Freakonomics podcast about this, and one of the things that they talk about on this podcast was what happens as you age in terms of your willingness to engage in risk and also to try new things. And they said, by the time you're 45, if you haven't tried sushi, you probably won't. It's one of those things that's one of the questions that they asked, have you tried sushi? And then they sort of did these follow-ups with people. And if you get to that point and you haven't tried these things, you're probably not likely to. So experiencers and strivers tend to be younger. They are spontaneous. That's one of the things that is typical, that when they travel, they have a tendency to not book hotel rooms in advance, just thinking, we'll find someplace when we get there. I used to be like this, and it turned out poorly on several occasions when you think that you can't possibly, not find a hotel room. And I'll remember this trip. I was going back to my home in New Mexico to pick up a horse for my dad and bring it back out here. And I decided we'd stop in Amarillo because we left late in the day, and that's sort of halfway between here and Santa Fe, where I'm from. And I thought, well, there's no point in getting a hotel. Like, Amarillo's got plenty of hotel rooms. It's on I-40, and God knows nobody wants to go to Amarillo for anything. If you've ever been to Amarillo, other than to spend the night because it's on I-40, it's well, I wouldn't say it's the ugliest town on earth. That probably goes to Midland and Odessa, Texas, if you want to know the truth, or Lubbock. That's another, hideously ugly town. El Paso is also a hideously ugly town. It's got the most inappropriately named military installation on the planet. The military base there in El Paso is called Fort Bliss, and there is nothing blissful about El Paso. I mean, it's just like a moonscape. So anyway, we stopped and tried to get a hotel room, and the first hotel, they're like, we're booked. Go down the road and we're booked. And we're now at the western edge of town and everything's booked. And I finally what's going on? The stud book for the American Quarter Horse Association is located in El Paso, or in Amarillo, Texas. And they were having their annual convention that week. And so all of the hotels, it's probably the only week out of the year that all of the hotels in Amarillo were booked. But we ended up having to go to Tucumcari to get a hotel room. So spontaneous, they like physical activity. They have a heightened sense of visual stimulation. So they like things like the reality and VR gaming that a lot of you probably are familiar with and play. My nephew is like a rabid gamer. I just don't understand this. It's just, they don't go to any, like, he doesn't go to his friends' houses because why would you go to their house? You can get online and you can play games together, right? You can Call of Duty or whatever that is the latest thing that he seems to be interested in. So heightened sense of visual stimulation. Makers, low access to resources. They have a tendency to have a huge distrust of government, outdoor activities. These are the group that you're most likely to find that live outside the city limits. Why do they like to live outside the city limits? Because usually in most places in this country, if you live outside the city limits, you don't have zoning. Now, there are some exceptions to that where you have counties that will engage in zoning. But historically speaking, once you get outside of the city, you don't have zoning regulations. Why would that be attractive? Well, if I want to put my skunk works on my land, these people have a tendency to think, I bought it, it's mine, don't tell me what to do with it. And if I want to put my, car collection or junk heap or whatever on my land, I should be able to do that. They have a tendency to believe in strong gender roles. This is one of the things that marks them as generally politically conservative individuals, because they have a tendency to believe that men should be men and women should be women, and you should abide by those sort of very traditional gender roles. They tend to be anti-intellectual, skeptical of people who have gone to college. My partner, who I used to raise horses with, had these two guys, and they were older, and they worked for us on the ranch there, and I was in my 20s, and of course, they're older, and so they think that they're wiser, and I was already a college professor at the time, and they would say things like, well, that's a nice theory, college boy, but that's not the way it works in the real world. And I'm like, I grew up on a cattle ranch. I sort of know, and I'll never forget to sort of illustrate the point that they don't know as much as they think they did. We're storing hay in the hay barn. We're stacking it up. And one of them decides that he's just going to start smoking. And hay barns are notorious, particularly when you're stacking hay, for catching fire, because tends to be dry. There's a lot of, hay dust in the air, and I come unglued, and I fired him, and there was more talk about, you don't know what you're talking about, college boy. And I'm like, well, when you blow yourself up someday, maybe we'll figure this one out. Anti-intellectual, they want to own land. They don't want to be told what they can do on their land, and they want to protect what is theirs. They have a tendency to, for example, have a fascination with guns and all things firearms. So we have lots of gun shows in Oklahoma. You'll find these people at the gun show, at the fairgrounds. How many of you have been to a gun show in Oklahoma? It's a harrowing experience at times. I went and got my concealed carry permit. I think I told you all this. And the first thing they do is they say at the class, to get your concealed carry, if you are a convicted felon, you can't get a concealed carry, and like half the people got up and left. It's like, you didn't know this? You didn't realize this? So distrust of government, tend to want to stay, outside on their own, engage in hunting and fishing activities and things like that. Survivors, this group is the lowest access to resources. They are enormously risk adverse. They are often older, on fixed incomes. Maybe all they have is Social Security. Now, generally speaking, in this country, the greatest transfer of wealth has been from young to old. But what we're seeing is a very bimodal distribution in many respects. And you have a lot of people who, because corporations no longer offer pension plans or what are called defined benefit plans. And one of the reasons that I have stayed here at UCO all of these years is because I have a defined benefit plan. It's called teacher's retirement. And when I retire, the day I retire, I can start drawing that, and I will draw the same amount of money for the rest of my life, along with Social Security, which is, again, another defined benefit plan. Most of these people only have Social Security. That may be all that they have to live off of. So they tend to be very thrifty. They're exceedingly brand loyal. Whereas experiencers are not brand loyal. They like anything that's new and flashy and are willing to try new things. These people tend to be exceedingly brand loyal to brands that they trust. Of all of the groups, they watch the most amount of television. It's an escape. They grew up on television and they like television. They're the least likely to have a computer or internet in their house, and they're the most likely to still have a landline. Any of you know anybody who still has a landline? Any of you still have a landline? Why do you still have a landline? Although I will tell you that when Verizon keeps dropping my calls, I've sort of yearned for the days of when we had landlines and your calls weren't like dropped perpetually. But why would you have a landline? You people don't even like talking on the phone. I think that we should call this something other than a cell. We still call it like a smartphone, cell phone. Like, you don't actually talk on it. It may be like a personal communication device, but you're far more likely to text than you are to actually talk on the phone, right? Why would you want to talk on the phone? You might, get negative feedback. Texting is far more impersonal. But this group is the most likely to still have a landline of any of the groups. And maybe that's their only phone. Any questions about consumer behavior? All right, so let's talk about organizational behavior. And this is the critical thinking challenge. Our organizations, and you should consider all three types: profit, which is traditional business, so businesses; nonprofits, which don't exist. They have constituencies and they oftentimes have customers, but they don't exist to make a profit for their shareholders. This is organizations like the Red Cross, Goodwill, the United Way, things like that. So nonprofits and governmental entities. So consider all three: profit, nonprofit, and governmental entities. Are they more rational than individual consumers, and why? Now I'm going to tell you the easy answer here is to say, and this is a critical thinking challenge, the easy answer is to say yes, they're more rational for a variety of reasons. But the harder one is to say no, they're just as irrational as as individual consumers. But that's the one that's going to get you more points, probably. You can probably do a really good job with coming up with yes, they are more rational, but it's harder to argue that they are equally as irrational as individual consumers. And that's the one that will probably get you more points. So you should develop a brief 5-paragraph response to the challenge. Well, what is that? So you want to have a thesis statement. What's the thesis statement? In this essay, I will discuss the differences between consumer behavior and organizational buying behavior. It is my opinion that organizations are far more rational than individuals, and I will illustrate this using 3 points. I'll discuss the United Way. I'll discuss, a traditional business like Marriott Hotels, and I'll discuss a governmental entity like the City of Guthrie as my examples. Then have 1 paragraph for each of those 3 substantive examples and a conclusion. Again, you don't have to do this, but it is a way for you to get those participation points for those of you who haven't gotten any participation points yet and who are afraid to talk in class. So provide 3 substantive examples and then reach a logical conclusion based on the discussion of the United Way, Marriott Corporation, and the City of Guthrie. I have illustrated that organizations are more rational than individuals, right? So, and that's your conclusion. So it doesn't have to be excessively long, but sort of that standard kind of way of academic writing. So the overview of business to business environment in terms of purchasing. And one of the things that we have students do in our sales program is we have them take purchasing and materials management, and they hate that class, but it's understanding, because salespeople have a tendency to not want to focus on these kinds of things, and it's kind of boring. Purchasing and logistics and stuff like that is kind of boring, but it's understanding that flip side of the transaction, what it is that businesses are looking for. And so when we talk about our sales program, by and large, on the whole, for the most part, we are not training people to go out and sell cars at a car dealership. Now, there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want to do, but most of our students and what we're actually training people to do is not engage in business to consumer sales, but business to business sales. And so it's understanding the complexity of the business environment and those criteria that we want you to understand. And our students, even though they don't like the class, they do come away, and when after they've had that class, generally, because all of our competitions revolve around business to business sales, they generally are better at being able to figure out what it is that the business wants, how to get there, and what the demands are, and the unique buying criteria that they face. So for profits, it's goods and services that they sell to consumers or to other businesses to then be made into consumer services or goods. Nonprofits like the Red Cross, the United Way, and then governmental entities. There are thousands of governmental entities. From a strictly legal standpoint, in the United States, we have 2 sovereigns. This is something that's unique about federal systems, and I've talked about this before, but redundancy is good. You have the national government, which is sovereign, and you have the state government, which is sovereign. Most governments in the world are what we call a unitary system, and a unitary system is one in which all power is derived from the national government, and that which the national government creates, it can destroy. So in theory, in France, I believe they have a unitary form of government. The government of France could destroy the city of Paris, the municipality of Paris. They could replace it and decide that they're just going to run that. Now, they probably are not likely to do that, but they could. Where they overlap in the United States, we call this concurrent powers. This is things like the power to tax, the power to regulate commerce, which is discussed in the Interstate Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, which says that the federal government has the power to regulate interstate commerce, commerce with the states and Indian tribes, and commerce with foreign nations. Intrastate commerce, I-N-T-R-A, state commerce, is left to the states to regulate. So states can regulate commerce, the federal government can regulate commerce. That's concurrent power. And in many instances, we see duplicative regulation as a result of this scheme. It's one of the disadvantages of having a federal system. If you want to open a restaurant, for example, in the United States, you're going to be regulated by both the federal government in terms of what you can and cannot do, and you're going to be regulated by the local state health department, which is going to come out and inspect. But let's, for example, suppose one of the big movements in restaurants right now, and something that experiencers and innovators like, is all of this locally sourced stuff. There's all of these restaurants that are popping up that are advertising that they are farm to market, locally sourced stuff, right? Well, how do you actually do that if you're going to serve things like it's very easy. So you can go to the farmer's market and you can buy vegetables. And there are lots of these places. There's a Mexican restaurant down in Automobile Alley. Have any of you know which one it is by chance? It's called cultivar, I think. It's locally sourced. So they go, they go to farmers markets and they go to distributors that sell local fresh produce and things like that. It's more difficult when you get into things like serving meat products. Why is that? Well, you can't just go out back and slaughter Bossy and throw her on the table. That's not the way it works, right? You have to go through a process that's regulated by the federal government, the USDA, the FDA, that tell you what you can and cannot do. You can't just go out and kill the chicken in the backyard and put it on the table. There was a time when you could, not anymore. So we have these dual regulations, this federal government, state government, and the federal government cannot destroy the states, right? We are sovereign. The territorial integrity of the state of Oklahoma is assured by the United States Constitution. And so we have this federal system, but in reality, from a strictly legal standpoint, we only have two types of governments. We only have national and state from a strictly constitutional law perspective. But at the state level and at the federal level, there are literally thousands of other entities that are governmental agencies. Now, again, in theory, because they're not sovereign, the state of Oklahoma, for example, could abolish the city of Guthrie. They could just do away with it. They could write a law that says, the city of Guthrie doesn't exist, and the state of Oklahoma could take over exercising jurisdiction. But from a practical standpoint, these are standalone entities, and there are thousands of them in the United States. And it's enormously profitable to do business with them. Why is that? Well, unlike doing business with businesses, which may fail and oftentimes do, the vast majority of businesses that are started in this country go broke in their first 5 years. Something like 90% of businesses fail. So if you are a provider of goods and services and you're selling to businesses, you run a risk that they may go broke. And if they're incorporated, you may not have any recourse in getting your money back from them if they go broke. Whereas if you do business with governmental agencies, you're almost 100% certain that you're going to get your money. And so we have really, in a practical sense, 3 layers. We have the federal government, we have the state government, and then we have all of these local entities. What are these local entities? Well, it consists of things like municipalities, cities and towns, school districts in Oklahoma, and then special use governmental entities. How many of you live outside the city limits? Anybody? Are you on rural water?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a governmental entity. A rural water district is formed. It's a special district. If you are in the rural water district, you generally have to get your water from rural water. Just like if you live in the city of Guthrie, you can't just go out and dig a well and start watering your yard and hooking up your house to the well. You have to buy water from the city of Guthrie. You have to buy water from the city of Edmond if you're in those districts, and rural water functions in much the same way. So they're a special unit governmental entity that provides services. They can be enormously profitable if you are a provider of goods and services and you get to be on their list of providers. And it takes a lot of effort to figure that out. The University of Central Oklahoma is part of a subunit of state government, which is constitutionally organized under the Constitution of the state of Oklahoma, called the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges, which now insists that they're Rousseau, even though the Constitution says that they're the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges, which means that we are governed by a separate entity under the state constitution, and we're a constitutional agency of the state, but we're a sub-agency, right, of the state. So we have all of these entities that you can do business with and figuring out how to do business. So for example, one thing that makes it unique in doing business with the state is figuring out the purchasing laws, and they are enormously complex with regard to state purchasing in Oklahoma. We can't just purchase things the way a consumer would or the way a business would. Industrial markets, there are 7.7 million entities. They produce or process a product or service for sale. 75% in the United States of these firms are now service firms. The biggest growth in the economy in the United States is in the services sector. We have moved beyond being an industrial economy into being what we call a post-industrial economy. Now, on the world level, that number is flipped. So when we talk about global markets for the third exam, 75% of the things that are produced at the global level are tangible goods and services, and only 25% are services. But as we have become a post-industrial economy, it's now in things like insurance, communication, legal, banking, financial services that are the real value in our economy. So it's in knowledge, in the knowledge sector, which is one of the reasons that you all are here in college, is because if you want to make it in this post-industrial economy, it used to be that you could go, in an industrial economy, and even without a college degree, you could go down. We had a GM factory here in Oklahoma City for years and years and years, and you could go work at the GM factory and you could bolt tires onto, I can't remember what they produced here. I think they did the Blazer at one point in time here at the Oklahoma City factory, and you could make a decent living. That's not what we do. We don't produce a whole lot of that stuff in this country anymore, right? Most of that is produced overseas. There are still automobile manufacturing plants in the United States. Historically, those were located in Detroit, but they're now located in various places, largely as a result of things like right-to-work laws, which make places like Oklahoma and the South more attractive to automobile manufacturers. So a lot of, cars, Hondas are manufactured, some of them are manufactured here, but the vast majority of things are now in this country service firms. So it's insurance, it's working for Goldman Sachs, or communication industries, or or legal firms, or financial services in the industrial markets. Reseller markets, there are 1.1 or 1.5 million retailers. There are 435 wholesalers in the United States, and they buy products and resell them without any reprocessing. So they may break items down. Wholesalers will break things down. You generally don't want to buy a pallet of stuff. They will break it down into smaller units, but they're not actually engaged in any kind of remaking of the product at all. So they're just middlemen. And then governmental, 3 levels, the federal, state, and the local. There are 89,500 entities. Oh, the light bulb is going out again. I thought I told them to replace this. So there are 89,500 entities in the United States. Again, these can be enormously profitable if you know how to sell to them. If you are a business-to-business firm and you know how to get government contracts. And let's come back. So in the United States and Canada and Mexico, as a result of NAFTA, we have something called the North American Industrial Classification System. And this allows for comparison of industrial and business markets among those 3 member nations. And it measures activities among the North American Free Trade Agreement members. Under the Trump administration, they renamed NAFTA, but it's basically still the same sort of structure and setup that was set up under the Clinton administration. One of the interesting things about this is when Trump started saying he was going to do away with NAFTA, when Clinton engaged in negotiation of NAFTA and then the implementation of NAFTA, unions were overwhelmingly opposed to it. And there were all kinds of ads being run by unions and their membership that said, what you're going to hear is a giant sucking sound of American jobs going to Mexico. And to some extent that did occur. We used to, for example, in Oklahoma, have a Wrangler jean plant. It was in the southeastern part of the state, I think. As I recall, it may have been like Durant. That went away when we got NAFTA. When Trump comes in and says, I'm going to destroy NAFTA and do away with it, all of a sudden unions were the ones that were supporting it, because although a lot of those jobs were lost, now there is such interdependence between the three nations. For example, the typical automobile that is sold in the United States, if it's manufactured in the United States, the parts and components for that vehicle will cross between the United States, Mexico, and Canada over 3,000 times before the final assembly takes place, and that actually reaches the consumer. And so we measure the activity among these members in these various categories. They produce studies that talk about market share, potential for growth and demand in goods and services, and the import competition among the member nations. There are usually questions about this on the second exam. In order to do this, they use a 6-digit code to track this and monitor this. So the first 2 digits represent the sector. For example, agriculture. So the large unit, agriculture, mining, or construction. Construction is 23. So those first 2 digits, if you're talking about construction, it will be 23. The third digit is a subsector. So we have, for example, construction of buildings, which would be 6, or civil engineering, which is 7. What is civil engineering? That's the building of infrastructure like roads, dams, bridges, things like that. The fourth number represents the industry group. So, for example, if we had construction and we're talking about housing, we would go 23, 6, and then the fourth would be residential buildings, which would be 1. The fifth designates a specific building. Specific industry, residential building construction or contractor. The 6th is a country level national industries. So single family residential housing, as opposed to, which would be 5, as opposed to multi-family residential housing, which would be 6. So single family residential housing are things like standalone homes. Multi-family are apartments, condos, townhomes, things like that. And it allows for us to look up among these categories the growth in individual sectors based on the studies that are produced. So one of the things that's happened as a result of COVID are there have been a number of sectors that have boomed. As people were not able to spend their money on things like going out to eat, all of a sudden housing projects have boomed and buying new houses. The housing market has taken off. It allows us to identify market opportunities. And there's one limitation: not all codes are available for all countries if too few organizations exist in that country. So for example, for years and years and years, in the United States, there is a booming cell phone provider business. You can get your cell phone coverage from a variety of different sources. That didn't used to be the case. Historically, before we had the breakup of the Bell telephone systems, it was pretty much a monopoly. And then they broke up the Bell telephone, and we had what were called the baby bells. And I remember when this happened. So we had Mountain Bell and we had Oklahoma Bell and stuff like that. And then there was this massive breakup. And when we got cell phones, all of a sudden there was a plethora of providers that came into the market. And they forced these larger entities to resell, basically, service to these various providers, like Verizon and T-Mobile and these other entities. That's not true for example, or at least it wasn't until recently, in Mexico. A guy who you've probably never heard of, but is a huge billionaire named Carlos Slim, pretty much controlled the communication industry in Mexico. So there wouldn't be a fifth digit in that example for Mexico because there were too few organizations historically in Mexico to run analysis on that. Characteristics of the business-to-business environment. The biggest and most important is that the demand is derived. This is one of the critical factors that if you're going to do the critical thinking challenge that you want to think about. How does the derived demand play a role in determining whether or not businesses are more or less rational? What does derived demand mean? It means that unlike you, when you buy something for your own use, you buy it because you have probably, more than anything, some kind of emotional commitment to that item. Why is it that you wear the products that you wear? It's an expression of your individuality and your identity. Do any of you just go into the store and willy-nilly pick up like shirts and throw them on? I need something to cover my back. I'll just grab the first thing that I see. I'd be willing to bet that most of you think about things like, that is hideously ugly. Why would I wear that? Or that's really cool. Right? That's not the reason that businesses buy stuff. They're not buying it because they're attracted to it or they like it or it's an expression of their individuality. They're buying it because it meets their needs to service their constituency group. If they're a for-profit, they're buying it so that they can produce or resell it or make something to produce or resell that somebody else needs. The typical purchases are larger in business to business. When you go buy a candy bar, you want one candy bar. You generally don't buy a whole case of Reese's peanut butter cups or whatever it is that you like. Businesses buy greater quantity of them. The number is generally smaller. So there are something like 370 million people in the United States. It's a rough figure. Most of those people, because we are a country that doesn't have great public transportation, own automobiles. Ford doesn't sell direct to consumer. They do it through a dealer network. So they sell to 3,100 dealers who then sell to the millions of customers in the consumer market. The buying objectives are usually, if you're a for-profit, to increase profits. Yes?
What would Tesla be?
Tesla's unique because they sell direct to consumer, right? They don't have a dealer network. And actually there have been issues with that because there are regulatory schemes that say you have to sell through a dealership, and Tesla has not done that. They've sold direct to consumers and they don't have a dealer network. Now there are advantages to having the dealer network, and part of the problems that Tesla has experienced has been as a result of not having a dealer network. But when they decided to launch this car, they decided that it was, there would be a lot of resistance among dealerships because historically companies are committed to sort of the products that they serve, right? And this was a whole new way of travel, and you were going to have a whole lot of different objections that your salespeople may not be experienced with. So Elon Musk just decided, well, I'll do it myself. Now, one of the problems that they had is because they understood how to make batteries. And I had a friend who was one of the first purchasers of a Tesla when they first came out. And a lot of the stuff for the price of the car, a lot of the stuff that you would think of that should be like higher quality and not fall apart, fell apart on that first Tesla that he had. You know, like little things that they didn't understand as a result of not having dealer network, who would go through and say things like, this isn't really the quality that it should be in terms of the trim levels in the car. They've gotten better, by the way. You know, I mean, they've now got experience, but you know, GM, Ford, Chrysler, Jeep have got years of experience in putting together these component parts and making them so that they're really, you know, durable and fairly good quality products. But Tesla decided they were going to sell direct to consumers. They do now have the old Volvo dealership in Automobile Alley is now a Tesla. I don't know what they call them because it's not a dealer, but it's a Tesla site, I guess, showroom, yeah. So most businesses, if you're a for-profit, your goal in buying is to increase profits. I want to buy this product so that I can resell it to a consumer or to reduce costs or increase revenues, right? So particularly nonprofits, what are they looking for generally? Because they're not interested in the profit, it's usually to reduce costs so that you can help more people. What does the Red Cross do? Well, they go into disaster areas and they provide services to people who have been affected by things like tornadoes and hurricanes and flooding. And they, you know, they want to provide as many services as they can. And so their goal is to reduce the cost. Or if you're a for-profit, to increase your revenues. You buy more so that you can sell more, so that you don't have stockouts, for example. The buying criteria, a big one is always going to be price. And this is the biggest objection that you get in the business-to-business environment. Depending on what kind of consumer, if you're a salesperson selling in the business-to-consumer environment, price may be an objection. It's the one that everybody can always raise. I can't afford that. But a lot of times when we're dealing with business to consumer, the objection may be enormously hidden or amorphous in trying to figure out why the consumer doesn't like something. A lot of times, particularly if you're dealing with consumer packaged goods, for example, it's not necessarily the price. Why is it that you use the toothpaste that you use? Probably because that's the toothpaste that your parents used or your family, right? So price is a huge one in the business to business world because, again, there isn't this emotional attachment to the good. It's simply about being able to increase by profits, increase revenue, or decrease costs. Price is one of the biggest things that you're going to find in terms of the objections. Quality specifications become important in the business to business environment. If you are putting together something and you need grade A oil, you need grade A oil. If you try to run, for example, in my family's business, because we have these large historic homes, we have an articulating boom lift. This is a self-powered man lift. You can drive it. It's got 4 big tires and it goes up and down and, you know, side to side in all these different ways. The hydraulic fluid that goes in that is a very specific grade of hydraulic fluid. You can't just throw, you know, John Deere hydraulic fluid into it. And so the quality specifications become important, whereas you don't think about that necessarily when you're going and buying, for example, the hamburger. You just know that you prefer Burger King to McDonald's, and not necessarily what all goes into that hamburger or the Beyond Burger if you're into that, you know, the commie product. I've actually finally broken down and tried Burger King's, let's see, Carl's Jr. has the Beyond Burger, the Impossible Burger. And actually I was surprised. I mean, it does not taste like a hamburger, but it wasn't horrible. I mean, I could tell the difference, but it wasn't like, just completely god awful. Yeah.
There's I'm not sure if it's a theory, I don't know what I would call it, but they're saying that plant-based meat will eventually be cheaper than regular meat by like 20, 30.
Oh, I'm sure it will. Yeah, I'm sure it will. And it's gotten better and better and better. I mean, in the last 5 years, it's gotten significantly better. I remember trying a plant-based burger, like 10 years ago, and I was like, there's no resemblance here to anything that resembles. But I was actually the Impossible Whopper. I was like, wow, it's not god awful, not hamburger, but it's getting better. And if you put it, so I think I told you all that we've hired, in my mother's business, we've hired a vegan, and we cook for all of our employees every day. And I'm actually the executive chef for our business. And so I've been trying to come up with vegan recipes and trying it. And so I've made a vegan chili that's actually not bad. And if you put the hamburger crumbles in something like that, it's really hard to tell the difference, because it's mostly just about texture and not necessarily about the flavor of it. So quality specifications become important. Delivery schedules, time is of the essence generally. Regulatory environmental issues become critical. We have just-in-time inventory control in most businesses, although Walmart used to have the best just-in-time inventory control. They don't seem to anymore. Historically, when I was growing up as a kid, if something wasn't on the shelf, you would ask the store, can you go check in the back and see if you've got it? That's no longer the case. Walmart doesn't have it's basically, Walmarts are big warehouses. Now they're sort of nice warehouses, but they don't have a big back section. Historically in the past, you used to have a huge section in the back where they would stock stuff and they would bring it out as they needed it. Now, because of just-in-time inventory control, if it's not on the floor, it's probably not back there because they're putting it out as they need it. Now, Walmart has lost their advantage in this, and they seem to have a lot of stock outs, at least the one in Guthrie, which is always horrific to me because then it means that I have to go somewhere else. And I'm like a man going to the gallows when I have to go to Walmart. I have found evidence that the Yeti exists, and they are in the Guthrie Walmart. They're constantly in front of me with their Yeti children. So those kinds of issues are really, really critical in the business-to-business area. Technical capabilities. What is it that you can provide in terms of service? So this is one of the areas where after the sale, generally speaking, that's not the end of it. For example, when we've gone through a number of learning management systems here at UCO, and I started, the first job I got teaching, I got because they figured I was young and could learn how to teach online. I've taught online since I was 22, and at that point in time, online education was basically a high-tech or glorified version of correspondence. We used to have, this used to be a big thing. We used to have what was called a correspondence office. We no longer have that anymore. And what correspondence courses were they had instructors that designed stuff, and they put together a syllabus, and you'd go and you'd buy the packet from the correspondence office, and then you would, study on your own at home in your own time, and you would mail things back in to the university, and the instructor would grade it and then post your grades. Well, we now have something called online, right? So we started years and years and years ago with this online education, and learning management systems at that point in time were very basic. It basically allowed you to put some content out there and to have a communication and sort of grade things. They've become far more complex in terms of what we can do with the LMSs. And the company that I used to work for when I was an executive vice president developed these systems for the K-12 market. Now at the higher education market, and this is an example of how technical capabilities become important, for the most part, when we discuss technical specifications for our learning management system, what we really want to know is how much we're going to have to invest in our own IT department being able to manage this, because computers update and software changes. You have to continually update the system, right? And so we want to know what the back end support is going to look like with regard to that product, and how much we're going to have to do, and how much the company is going to do, and what kind of service contracts we can have. The company I worked for designed learning management systems for the K-12 market, which meant that it was not only the back-end support, but unlike D2L, where I have to put everything in D2L that I want, I have to create it myself. The product that we provided for the K-12 market did assessment, content, and learning management all in one. So we had all of the content, all of those titles that you can get at the K-12 level were loaded automatically into the LMS, because we don't trust teachers in primary and secondary education to come up with their own content. You can't do that, right? Teachers have to follow prescribed, at that market, they have to follow prescribed sorts of lesson plans. And that's what the company did. So that was a technical specification that added to the complexity of the product. Whereas at UCO with D2L, we're not worried about what professors are capable of putting on there, because we expect them to have subject matter expertise and to be able to do it themselves. So that's one less complexity. We're more concerned with the functionality and the support services that we're going to have to utilize it. Warranties become enormously important. What happens and who's responsible if this product breaks? If all of a sudden it's not supported by the platforms that we're using. Past performance becomes enormously important in business to business. So you'll have usually a course of dealing. A lot of times in the business to consumer market, you will go wherever the cheapest product is. Are any of you horribly loyal to your car dealer? No. When you go buy your next car, are you going to go back to Jackie Cooper or Broadway? It used to be Broadway before they're no longer in business. Bob Howard or Bob. No, you're going to decide what kind of car you want, and then you're going to like shop around, and you don't care if it's Bob Howard, Bob Moore, whatever. You're probably going to go somewhere that's cheap. Yeah.
My dad is pretty loyal to CarMax.
That's kind of an unusual situation, and they are developing. Because of their model, they do have a more loyal customer base than most car dealers do. Sewell Cadillac is another exception. I've talked about them. People are very loyal. You will find Sewell Cadillacs in Oklahoma. In fact, I had to drive my mother's car today, and it's a Sewell Cadillac, because the experience is so good and the customer service is so good. But most people are not. Most people will, if I want this car, I'm going to find the cheapest one, and I'm not terribly brand loyal to the car dealer. That's not true in business to business markets, because you have this course of dealing, and the switching costs are exceptionally high with regard to business. So you have this course of dealing. Production facilities and capacity become important factors, and knowing what those are and their capabilities, because if you're going to have just-in-time inventory, you want to know that they can produce it and that they can get it to you based on the demand schedules that you give them. The relationships are usually long-term. Again, you may go to the same supermarket a lot because it's the closest one to your house, and that's probably why you go there, because it's a convenience factor. But in business to business, you usually have these long-term partnerships. There are formalized buying centers. So for example, UCO and our purchasing of D2L, our LMS, we have a very formalized process. For anything over $5,000, there are only 2 people that can sign a contract on this campus for that. That doesn't mean that professors like myself aren't important in influencing the buying decision, but I can't decide I want to use a different LMS from the university and just go out and buy it on my Pro card. It has to go through a formalized, so they do an RFP, a request for proposal. People submit to the proposal. The purchasing department then opens those bids all at one time, and then they go through a formal process of evaluating those bids and selecting one. And then the only person who can sign for something that large is either the vice president for administration and finance or the president. So users are important. Professors at UCO are important in determining. We have a committee that was formed when we decided to do away with the last LMS that we had, and professors sat on that committee. Staff and students also helped select it, but they aren't the ones that can ultimately decide. Then the purchasing department puts together the bid process and opens those. And then the deciders ultimately are the president and vice president for administration. But there are gatekeepers along the way that may not be able to determine what we purchase, but they can knock things out. If your bid comes in after the deadline for the RFP, this is one of the differences in consumer decision-making and institutional decision-making. If your bid comes in after the deadline, statutorily, in many instances, we can't accept or consider that bid. Now, there are ways you can get around that. And those gatekeepers in the purchasing department have the power to do things like, so they may not be, when I was associate general counsel here at UCO, I used to say I had no positive power, but I had an enormous amount of negative power. I couldn't decide to do anything, but I could stop things from happening. All contracts for the sale of goods that were over a certain amount had to go through the office of the legal counsel to be approved for the form. And the state purchasing rules are enormously complex. And I could sit there and say, this doesn't meet the rules. And I had a big denial stamp, denied, a lot of negative power. And so understanding those kinds of formal situations in business to business becomes enormously critical. We have different classes, and the buying situation will determine how complex the buying process is. A new buy involves a greater deal of risk for the business and generally will go through a much higher degree of formalization and processing. A straight rebuy is where we just reorder existing products or services from an acceptable list of providers. And that usually involves less. Or if we have a modified rebuy, when we change product specifications, or we start looking at price and delivery and suppliers. And so this is sort of like the middle ground where it's a modified rebuy. We're gonna buy basically the same thing. The first LMS that we bought was a far more extensive process than when we bought D2L, because we sort of know what it is that we're looking for, right? We've already have an experience in learning management systems. The stages in the buying decision are similar to the consumer decision. There's a problem recognition. This generally involves multiple people though. When online education first got going, it involved a recognition that other schools were doing this. So then we go through an information search. Generally, this has a formal process. So unlike consumers who sort of think about what they've got, there's a formal request for proposals. Then alternative evaluation, there's generally fewer suppliers for things. Then we have the purchasing decision. It can take longer. Buying something for a university, if it's over $5,000, if it's a large purchase, can take years. This was something the company that I worked for dealt with. The buying cycle in selling to schools was enormous. It took a year usually from start to finish. Whereas if you're selling to a consumer who needs a new car because their car broke down, they're going to go out and buy a car within what? Days or weeks, not months or years. And then post-purchase decisions, highly formalized and monitored to determine whether or not it meets the goals and the requirements that we've set. And I made it just under time. So again, we will not have class on Thursday because you'll have that time to take the exam. It will be on D2L. It is, again, because it is a critical thinking process, it will be open note and open book. You can use your resources. I've never had anybody tell me as a lawyer, don't look at any of those books behind me. So that's sort of my educational philosophy. Yes.
So we have a week to do it?
A week. Yep, you'll have from Thursday to Thursday to do it. You have a week from today until next Tuesday, complete the critical thinking challenges if you want to do that. So think about it again. For those of you who don't have any class participation points, this is your opportunity. And if you do, it's your opportunity to earn more than just 10 points per class period on those. Yes.